Are we
when
starting?
we're recording. When I grew up, it's amazing how fashions changed. Like if someone had a beard in Italy, it was considered a sign that everything had gone wrong in their lives.
Yeah, it checks out.
And my my dad would be like, "Oh, I saw our friend Paolo, and oh, he had a beard." Like as if
they're grieving 40 days of mourning.
Like something terrible had happened to them. They couldn't even get it together to shave. Like that was like a basic thing that even if your life is falling apart, that you shave in the morning.
Right.
And if you haven't done that, you've really let yourself go.
Yeah, you're like a prisoner of war. You don't have access to a razor anymore.
Yeah, or you just like your life is just falling to pieces.
Yeah, mine's just a kind of considered apathy. I will shave it the day I get the vaccine.
Yeah, and why is that? What's the philosophy behind it?
People are very bad at remembering how long, like temporal durations that have happened backwards in time.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you say, okay, the Civil War was 150 years ago, people will be like, all right, or some amount of time, but they don't really understand how to multiply their lives and their lifespan out to that. But if you say, starting now and ending in 2170. 150 years into the future. That feels significantly longer in duration than 150 years into the past. So what I don't want to do is have people kind of misremember how long ago it actually was, February, March, when the world shut down and quarantine started, right? And this is a accurate timekeeper for how long it's been. So nobody can come to me and say like, oh, it's only been like 3 months. And I'll be like, no, it's been this long.
But your beard obviously grows at your own special rate. So
Yes,
it's just for yourself, basically.
Yeah, it's my own subjective personal timekeeping device.
Yeah. Mind you, I've said this before, but when I met Patrick, it was the opposite. Shaved face and hair bigger, much bigger than the beard is now.
Well, and maybe something has gone wrong. The world has kind of ended. One of the multiple horsemen of the apocalypse are upon us. So yeah, I do have a beard, and yes, I do in the Italian tradition.
Noted. So I woke up in the middle of the night, as I often do, and then put my YouTube on, and you have this wonderful algorithm that does autoplay, and it's based on your, what you're watching, and also just past preferences that you've had. And so since I'd been on this Leonard Cohen kick, I did that for a while, but then it switched to like Sean Carroll talking about quantum physics, and then suddenly I fell asleep again, and I started having dreams about Bert Dreyfuss and Sean Carroll talking philosophy and physics, and they were so vivid, the dreams. And they were obviously just caused by what I was listening to and what I've been thinking about with our podcast and everything. And I woke up just thinking about dreams because I think it's a domain ripe for real and rich interpretation. And that sometimes people who have a scientific worldview want to be dismissive of the symbolic interpretation as if it's an either or thing. So I remember, when I was in college, if you talk to even serious philosophers like John Searle or something, they'd say, oh, it's just garbage in your brain. That's recycling, right? And it seemed like that was necessary in order to reinforce a kind of neurobiological view of what dreaming was. And I'm sure there's such an explanation. I'd love for you to talk about that. But to me, what I'd really like to talk about is how do you do both? I'm sure there's a neurobiological explanation of why we make music, why we dance, why we write. And I think it would be a shame to use that explanation to somehow dismiss more symbolic interpretations of what a dance means, right? And I would love to get to a place where you can be both rational and see the world as, a specific world, whether it's the world of dreams or the world of literature or the world of dance, as a place rich for meaningful and serious interpretive work. That's what I woke up thinking about.
So first off, I think it's a huge disservice in the last kind of century of psychology and neuroscience that dreaming has it has been pushed aside as a legitimate kind of topic of inquiry for a lot of neuroscientists. And that's on its face completely absurd. Like you have a conscious experience without external input, generated exclusively and entirely by the workings of your brain, that is remembered as such. That has the people that you vaguely remember, but things are distorted and the rules are broken and the laws of physics change. This is fascinating on every experimental level. And just kind of Freud ruined it. And like rather, not even Freud, but like associative thinking about Freud and kind of, he got, I don't know if canceled is a word that we can retroactively use, but he got canceled in his own way at times, and just people don't talk about it seriously anymore. Some do, of course. There are sleep researchers who are some of the most fascinating people to talk to. Anesthesiologists will talk to you about it, talk your ear off over dinner, and how the difference between anesthesia and sleep and why one is not like the other. Yeah, I mean, so I'm okay talking about like the symbols and interpretations of dreams, but I would also say then that up for grabs and on the table would be the symbolic interpretations of just waking life and waking thoughts. If like, I see no reason to apply symbolic interpretation to one and not the other.
I do.
Go on.
Well, because, dreams are created by your mind, it seems like what appears in that perceptual consciousness is decided by what you've been thinking about. If I look outside and look at that tree, it's probably because there's a tree out there, right? But it's like I had a film professor at Berkeley who said when somebody eats in real life, it's because they're hungry. But if they eat in a movie, it's because the director wants to tell you something, right? But people don't get hungry in movies. Their characters and everything is written out. So there you should interpret, like you should think about why they're eating, and them being hungry isn't the reason. So it's the same in dreams. Like if the tree appears, it's not because there's a tree there, then there must be something that the tree represents for you, right?
No, but Sean Carroll appeared in yours because there was a Sean Carroll.
So that's a literal thing. That's often that did have outside stimulus.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
But
then the question
is,
but the question
usually
is,
it doesn't.
What percentage of the dream states do not have an outside component at its root source, at its causal end? And I would argue that 100% of what you do end up dreaming about does at some point originate from the outside world. So that's why I find it no different than like, okay, yes, you're directly looking at a tree in waking life now, and you're saying, oh, well, we're not going to interpret that because it's directly impinging on your brain. Yeah. But a dream is just maybe a few steps removed in that Dick Cheney.
But those steps is where the interpretation takes place. That's right. That's where, because you could have dreamt one thing. Had I not listened to Sean Carroll, and I had listened to Sean Carroll yesterday, I would be more dismissive of it. Had I listened to Sean Carroll 5 years ago and not listened to him since and suddenly dreamt about him, I would want to like analyze why he appeared in my mind now,
but it's
versus
still just
not any of the other nights in 4 years. There must be something else going on in my mind that brought that to to saliency.
But if we're talking about causal impact, a 5-year temporal gap versus a 5-minute temporal gap is not different in kind. It's different in quality.
I think it is different in kind.
So I have to finish the Dick Cheney thing only because people might wonder why I referenced Dick Cheney. Yeah. Because when Dick Cheney shot that guy, he gave an interview, shot the guy in the face with like some sort of musket round or shotgun blast. In his interview, he did something brilliant, absolutely brilliant. The week after, where he said, "Yeah, sure, I pulled the trigger which fired the bullet which hit the guy." He put 3 steps of causal efficacy between him and the act, between him and the consequence.
Yeah.
And so this is what I mean about the causal impingement on the brain, or like how many steps are there between the dream thought and the outside world's kind of control over you or over your senses. And so it's the same move. It's the same argumentative move to place how many orders, how many degrees are there. And I agree with you that the interpretation should happen.
We do it correctly too. Let's say someone had a brain tumor that caused them to be violent and kill somebody. That would be a very direct causal chain, and we might forgive them more easily if it was directly caused by a physical thing in the brain. And yet all murderers are somehow caused by things in the brain. But if it's not that direct, and there was like steps during which we assume certain choices were made, then we assign more moral culpability. So I think that the interpretation of the dream aligns with moral culpability in the sense that the more places there are for options, the more we should look at why one was chosen over the other. if it's a direct stimulus, if you had like wired my brain and you said, let's force Tao to dream this, and there was a way to do that with some sort of, brain stimulation, then there would be really no reason to look for the meaning.
I see. So the argument being the difference between 5 years and 5 minutes is that with 5 minutes, if you're just sampling from the last 5 minutes, you don't have that many options to sample from. But if you're sampling from the last 5 years, you have orders of magnitude, millions of more things to draw from. So when you get something from 5 years ago, it's more meaningful.
Exactly.
Because it's rarer, or because it's one of more it's a choice amongst options.
It's because it's a choice amongst options. Exactly.
It's the definition of elegance.
How so?
It's the same Latin root, which means to choose, to elect.
Oh yeah,
Elegare. So it's a
Elegare,
choice amongst options. So I don't believe. Okay, so if you played Tetris for the first time, video game Tetris, you'd never played before in your life.
Yeah.
There's a great study. It's been replicated multiple times out of the late 90s. It's got like unique shapes, right? Tetris, the little tetraminos, unique little geometric shapes. If you have someone play that during the day, you can see very clearly, almost like it's a invisible kind of sunroof in the back of the brain. You can actually see, because the brain encodes things spatiotopically, you can see those shapes in the neural activity, right? You can actually see the kind of L shape or the line.
Incredible.
You really can. And so you can watch someone play Tetris. And then the question is, what happens to them throughout the day after they stop playing Tetris? They keep replaying. You can see those shapes. When they get into hypnagogic sleep, the first sleep stage, like right after you fall asleep, the first kind of 30 to 50 minutes, I think, don't quote me on that, they're playing Tetris. You can see it in their brain. They're playing Tetris, and it's at 1,000 speed, 1000x, and they are just like all the shapes, all the configurations, all of everything. So that happened from the outside world, right? It impinged upon their brain. They played Tetris. It was an outside stimulus. Later, when they sleep, they're prototyping every possible simulated exploration of what could and could not have happened. Why is it the case that when we go to sleep, we get better at something when we wake up? How is it the case that every single day you're getting better at piano after you get a good
I noticed
night's
it,
sleep?
especially if I practice something new before going to bed, and then I'll wake up playing it better than I did the night before. That's incredible.
You're simulating the ever-living hell out of it.
Yeah.
Okay, so we believe that's true. It kind of makes a simple kind of sense when we're talking about like video games, a visual geometry, a motor task like this. I argue that thinking is just a motor act and skill like any other. I think the brain just does that. It just does motor output. All it does is simulate motor output and try to get better at it. So when you have a thought, when you listen to a podcast, that is no different than you playing Tetris for the first time.
Right.
Your brain is taking speech acts, which are motor acts. They come from this throat thing here. Mm-hmm. It's a motor act in the same way that your scales are motor acts.
Yep.
When it hears those, when it says things, when it has a conversation with a person, every single one of those will be prototyped by the sleeping brain in the exact same way that learning Tetris for the first time would be, in the exact same way that learning a new scale would be. So it's not surprising at all to me that you end up with these kind of recurrences or remembrances or nostalgic memories of things. You are just prototyping the hell out of everything you've ever experienced in order to get better at it when you wake up in the morning.
Yeah. But I still think we have to beware of reductionism, especially as scientists. I'm not a scientist at all. As a philosopher, I say beware of reductionism because you're limiting the domain of meaning, and that meaning is not made up. It's so let's take chess again. We've talked about this, right? So if you get better and better at chess, you'll get better and better at reacting to the situation on the board, right? And let's say evolutionarily, we play games in order to show off so that we can find a mate more easily. I'm just making this up pulling this out of my ass. But I imagine like there's some, even when we play music, there's some way that we're showing off our dexterity that probably, attracts a mate or something.
It's a bird call.
Yeah. So I'm interested in the place where we can both acknowledge that it's a bird call and find the wealth of meaning that a particular composer put in a piece of music, both on purpose and by accident. And as interpreters of a piece, we're able to discover things about the psychology of the composer, about what it was like to be human during the time that the thing was written. If we look at Bach and like all of the I don't even want to use the word spiritual because it seems like new agey nonsense. I want to look for more literal, uncontroversial, rich meaning. Because I think, like you said, neuroscientists can't talk about dreams because it's been ruined by woo-woo Freud, right?
It's a kind of like, I see it as like almost a trickle down or collateral damage from specifically the interpretation of dreams has kind of colonized the space so that dreams themselves, the phenomena of dreams themselves, are rarely considered scientifically. And when I say rarely, I know sleep researchers who dedicated their career to this and are very scientific and very good. So I'm not.
So let's talk about the
disparaging them.
interpretation of literature instead. I mean, like, obviously there's a biological reason we write, okay? So again, some sort of bird call. How do we remember and kind of compartmentalize in our mind that it's okay to have a physical explanation of what a book is, the way it's made up of certain, molecules, and that nowhere in there is the meaning of Hamlet?
So yeah, I would make a distinction between like the actual physical text, like ink on vellum,
Right.
versus the author's intention or the author's act versus the critical reception or the interpretation ex post facto, right?
Yeah.
And the way that I see talking about dreams from a neuroscientist's point of view is I take the brain's point of view. I say, what does the brain know about the world? What is it attempting to do? And like, by what means does it do so? And everything that happens after the fact, I consider useless in translation.
But why useless?
Not useless, but useless is too strong a word. Extraordinarily rich and meaningful for the human who's a storytelling, emotional, meaning-making machine.
Yeah.
But from the point of view of the brain, completely useless. In the same way that Shakespeare's,
but isn't that limited view of the brain?
Yeah, well, it is, but Shakespeare's dead. So the critical theory today, does it matter for Shakespeare? No, he's dead. He's already done his thing. It's come and gone. The brain has already done its thing. It's already dreamed. It's come and gone. It's solidified its synapses. It's cleaned out its cerebral spinal fluid. It's taken its lysosomal storage and cleared it of its debris. Like, that's what it's doing when you're sleeping. It's maintenance. And so
that still seems somewhat dismissive and reductive to me. I think it can be those things. I'm not disagreeing.
Yeah,
but I'm interested in how we can think about things as being true on multiple levels.
Yeah, no, I certainly allow the modern critical interpretation of Hamlet to exist, right?
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with it, and I enjoy it. I read it myself. It's fun. It reshapes how I think about the past. It reshapes my present. I learn something from it. And I think people can absolutely take kind of introspective lessons from cataloging their own dreams, from talking about dreams, from understanding why it is the case that certain people from 5 years ago pop into existence and others don't. The kinds of anxiety dreams that they have are certainly prototyping who they are as a person. If you were like, my dreams are mostly small minutia of social situations that go devastatingly wrong.
Right.
That's it. I begrudge my lack of creativity. Like, I want to be Dali, on the inside of my head. I want to pretend there's like melting clocks and orgies and all kinds of things happening and going on. But no, it's not. It's just, you notice that, like, in a room full of people, someone knows something, another person knows another thing, and they don't seem to be on the same page. And it's like I'm in a murder mystery party every single time, and I'm just like noticing the differences between who the characters are. And it just ends up like 6 hours of stress and anxiety, right? That reflects something
maybe because
about,
you think too much about dreams being this.
Oh, it's my punishment for being reductive?
Yes, exactly. You're gonna.
No, I think it's the fact that it reflects like what my brain kind of focuses on in real life, which is I sit and kind of watch and observe social situations play out, and I model and prototype people, and my brain can't not do it. That's why it's so hard for me sometimes to write or work when someone else is in the room, because my brain 100% theory mind jumps into their point of view, and my dreams reflect that. And so I think it's just like making the superpower / Greek flaw worse over time as I reinforce that this is what my brain likes to do, and now it's better at it every single morning.
I looked up this morning about dreaming in animals. It seems all mammals dream. Dolphins dream the least. Their like brain activity is the smallest, and then human beings are about in the middle. And
What the hell do they know? I haven't yet, as someone who knows a bit about brain imaging, I do not know how to image a dolphin's brain.
oh really?
How the hell do they know what the brain activity looks
And then
like?
it said like possums and like armadillos dream the most. I think maybe based on REM.
No, I'm sorry, no.
Well, look it up after.
Okay.
I think they've studied like REM cycles and
Yeah.
and activity.
They might be inferring based on like twitching, the same way this ring infers based on my activity, which whether or not I'm in deep or REM sleep or like light sleep. So maybe they did it by like watching a camera, but there's
Couldn't you
no.
imagine Herzog making a film about the dreams of
Oh,
armadillos?
100%. And like, do you know that humpback whales sleep vertically? Have you ever seen this?
No.
It's the most beautiful thing in nature. Pods of humpback whales, I don't know why. I guess they're so big, they just feel safe. They sleep vertically, like
Wow.
skyscrapers. It's
Uh-huh.
the most glorious thing I've ever seen.
Wow.
Like huge, giant, like 5-6 story, just blobs vertically, and just like what is vertical in the ocean? Nothing is vertical in the ocean.
Yeah,
Kelp.
some seaweeds. I was
Yeah.
gonna say, yeah. So I guess your it does make sense if animals dream that they are practicing their, when you see the dog, running in it and in his sleep.
But you don't
it's
give
just
them
practicing.
interpretive capacity?
No, I think I agree with Heidegger that like what's unique to being human is our ability to take a stance on what it is to be human. So that's why he went so far as to say that to be human is a different mode of being. We haven't talked about modes of being, but I think it's a really interesting, that's what being in time is mainly about. And I don't feel quite expert enough to talk about this. So I think, forgive me in advance if you're a Heidegger scholar or specialist or professor, but
When I first read Being in Time is when I first started drinking coffee.
why?
Because I couldn't handle it without coffee. I would go and sit at Non and Curry at Berkeley. And like it was just too much. I think I was reading Being in Time and Ulysses at the same time, the same semester.
Yeah.
And I was like,
That does sound
okay.
like a lot.
And I found myself going to Non and Curry for lunch, and then they had this like infinite dispenser of chai tea.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't even know that chai tea had caffeine in it. I was young and dumb. And I just kept drinking it and just being like, well, and I just would stay for hours. And I had no idea why, but I just kept drinking this chai tea. And all of my copy of Being in Time and Ulysses all have these chai tea stains everywhere all over them.
Everyone made fun of Bill Clinton in the 90s for being evasive and saying it depends what your definition of is.
Yeah.
And it does seem absurd, but it's not at all, right? Like
Yeah, no.
we philosophers and regular people for thousands of years took for granted that what it was to be was a fixed thing. Like it either is or it isn't. It exists or it doesn't, right? But Heidegger came in and said, no, there's actually different ways for things to be, and that they are fundamentally different. So to be as an object is different than to be as equipment, right? So like the way the hammer shows up for the skilled carpenter hammering, it has very little to do with the underlying properties of the hammer taken as object.
Right.
So if you pick up the hammer as a skilled hammer, you won't be able to have that experience of the thing unless you have the skills for hammering, and you have the cultural practices around carpentry, and you have nails, and you have wood, and all this kind of stuff. And then what can show up as a hammer is actually infinitely diverse because it just has to fulfill this function, right? And then there's the third mode of being. So you have being as equipment, you have being as a object with properties, which is the most traditional way to see being. And then there's human being, or Dasein, which is the being whose being is an issue for it. And so when we appear, it's not as an object. You are an object also. And I could take you as that thing with a beard on it over there. But I'm also encountering you, and I could use you as equipment and somehow
That's a
I
different
don't know.
It's a different episode.
Yeah. But then most fundamentally, when I see you as a human, I'm seeing this interpretive essence that you're both taking a stance on what it is for you to be Patrick which is transcends all of the physical things, since your cells change every whatever many years, and you're but there's this consistency of being Patrick and being Tao, and that is a different mode of being. And I think that so when we dream, we can interpret it and it can be real. And I didn't finish my thought about the chess. So like if you give a motor neuron like interpretation of what it is to get good at chess, how do you do that while including the real skillful interpretation of like the queen being impotent in the position that she's in? That's a fact about the chess board at a particular moment that is no way contained in the physical interpretation of it, nor is it just an opinion. It's not just posited by the player. Like there's an objective reality in which the queen is impotent, but that objective reality only exists for the skilled chess player who knows enough about chess to be able to see that. So in a way it's interpretive, but it's also factual, and it's also significant, meaningful, and 100% true, right?
But the thought itself, when it's uttered internally, if it is, unless it's kind of invisible to the chess master, but when it's uttered internally, that is still a motor act. Even the sentence, the queen is impotent, or the sentence like, I need to control the center of the board. Those are motor acts that exist above the motor acts of the actual moves themselves. So when I move my arm, let's say, I'll do proper posture. If I move my arm, and my goal...
You move the guitar with your head.
Let's say my goal is to grab my espresso cup, which I am feeling an urge to do.
Go for it.
And as I do this, let's imagine the kind of seat moves. It's rotating in some random way. It's like floating in the ocean or something. As I move my hand towards it, I'm going to have to update my reach as I reach, right? I'm going to have to update my goal as I reach, where my hand will have to navigate what it sees and incorporate that. So that means that there are both kind of smaller scale grasping motor plans, where once I get to the cup, I'm going to, grab it like this. But then also the whole kind of degrees of freedom and motor apparatus of moving my shoulder in all the different ways, all the way down my arm, all those muscles are also almost like on a meta level, controlling the larger picture of where broadly my arm is, so that I can kind of finely tune once I get to that grasp. The thought, the queen is impotent in this position, is like a shoulder degree of freedom movement. It is just a larger conceptual motor act, motor statement, motor plan that contains within it embedded the finer grained ones, which are the individual movements of the individual pieces. So nowhere in here, nowhere in a full scale interpretation at every different level can you find a thought that is not a motor act or plan. That's why I think you can be slightly reductionist, because there is no such thing as an interpretation in like a Gödel's incompleteness way. There's no such thing as an interpretation that exists outside of the set of motor plans.
I think there's a disease of reductionism among scientists that even people who seem almost immune to it aren't. And
where does it exist then? Yeah, no, I mean,
I'm curious.
I'm open to it.
So right? how does the thought that I'm trying to think of something even more abstract. How does a mathematical truth, a priori statement about like some mathematical, 2 + 2 = 4, how is that motor?
It is likely the case that any individual fact, any individual statement or belief about the world is remembered spatially. So the brain is a spatial kind of machine, spatial monster. All it does is figure out layouts of things around it and encode like memories, experiences, and I think facts, and even abstract ones, somewhere along that grid, somewhere along the kind of like grid as it's remembered. Mm-hmm. And so if you have 2 + 2, you're simply connecting the dots. That's simply what's it called? Trace. I don't know what it's called. You're like, that statement exists nested spatially within other statements. The brain is only remembering things based on spatial layout, which means that in order to understand the relationships between different thoughts, in order to understand the relationships between that mathematical statement and another mathematical statement, there's a proximity to them. And that proximity manifests as like when you go into your mind palace, or a mathematician goes into his or her mind palace and navigates through different kinds of true premises in order to create a larger one. They are compiling like different pieces and parts of a spatial layout into a motor plan. You're coursing when you have a new thought. When you try to make a mathematical proof connecting multiple different premises, 2 + 2 = 4, and then some I equals, e to the 0, you're coursing through the possible worlds of ways of laying that out and connecting them. I believe
even with
motor
imaginary numbers. Like, it's funny you said I. Like, if you're thinking about truly abstract concepts that don't map onto the world, 2 + 2 is too easy to think about spatially and like refer, in terms of fingers and stuff like that. But there are mathematical truths that are purely
like
divorced
zero.
from.
Just take 0, right?
Yeah.
There's no numerical essence of 0 out there in the world. You can't count 0 on your fingers. You can abstractly do so, but there's no visual perception of the lack of something, right? But yet we still have 0. So how is 0 encoded in the brain? I have no idea.
So isn't that counter to your theory?
No, you can have something that's just the absence of, you can have a phenomena that is the absence of stimulus.
Right.
But I do think, to your point, like, how do we do imaginary numbers? How do we do imaginary, like, let's go back to dreams. How do we do imaginary anything? And does that count as, like, do you believe that when you have the phenomenon of a dream and you have the subjective experience and it's rich and it's full and it's colorful and there's people wandering around, is that the same thing that's happening in the brain as when you imagine a imaginary number in a mathematical concept? Like, when you say imaginary, do you mean those two things synonymously?
No, I just mean that I'm just very curious, and I feel like I hope I don't sound like a broken record. I want to come up with a conceptual framework in which both the scientific reductionist view and the rich, meaningful, interpretive view are not only acknowledged but valued as potentially true in the deepest sense of truth. And obviously we can talk about that if we ever get Mark Rathall on here. Like, truth doesn't just mean correspondence to reality. There's a deeper conversation to be had there, and probably a whole episode to be had about truth. But what I want to resist is the idea that just because a dream is the brain doing this thing, just because you are having these motor neuron practicing happening, does not mean that it's not also true that this is a place that, if you look at it carefully, you can find useful interpretation that, who knows whether it goes, Freud said it's all repressed sexual stuff. Maybe that's probably not true, but maybe there is some stuff from your childhood that you're remembering, and that we should if you pay attention to it, you have an opportunity for a richer life because you are spending time in that domain of interpretation, let's say.
Yeah.
Even that seems a little reduction. But or let's say Jung, who said, okay, we don't want to just look at it as individual sexual repression, but we should also look at what does it say about the culture? Like, it is interesting that we often have shared dreams, anxiety dreams, like of going to school with your pants off, right? Like, no one told me as a kid, like, oh, that kid had that dream, and therefore I remembered that dream. Like, we all had a shared cause of like anxiety manifesting, of like suddenly being caught in public without your clothes on, right?
And teeth crumbling. It's one of the most common dreams across the entire world.
Yeah, and I grind my teeth at night, so I know that that's partially caused when I have that dream, probably by the physical act of me grinding my teeth and me worrying about my teeth breaking, which they actually have. So, and yet,
what does that say about the world then, if teeth crumbling is a common anxiety dream?
That's what I'm curious. I would like to be able to ask that question and do so in a serious, way that can be acknowledged as valid by the scientist who also tells you it's got this physical reason.
Well, so I very,
and that's why philosophically I want to talk about that very possibility of having levels of interpretation.
So I very much believe that. So I started kind of my counter argument with, well, that's fine if you're going to interpret dreams. All I said was, you should also interpret waking thoughts.
Yeah.
And I mean that because I think
Maybe you're right. Maybe you've talked me into that. Go on.
Well, so there is absolutely, I think, a pattern and a meaningful and rich and learning based reason our spontaneous thoughts kind of end up going the way that they go. They take the paths that they take during the day. And I think basically there's no fundamental difference between the brain during the day and at night. Like, yes, there's going to be different like rhythms and waves and things, but the brain is still trying to accomplish the same goal. And so that's all I meant, that there's two things I would want to do if we add an interpretive layer atop dreams and in a non-reductive way. I would want to do two things. One, I would want to say, okay, that's great, but also we need to interpret daily waking thoughts. And why stop at one level of interpretation? Like, why not allow for multiple kinds of interpretations all the way up to astrology, say, if you want to go back.
That's what I was worried about. I was going to bring that up as my objection, because if you start thinking like, oh, the falcon appeared and therefore that means that like something terrible is going to happen,
you get metamagical pretty quickly.
Yeah. But at the same time, I was thinking about the fact that the trees outside, yes, that's caused by an objective reality of the tree being there. But the fact that we see it as a tree, the fact that I'm talking about it now and looking at it instead of looking at you, that is rich territory for interpretation,
absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a woman
because of the choices. Like we could be talking about this, but instead we're talking about that. So then to say like we're talking about the tree because the tree is there is an impoverished like explanation. Whereas if you then understood the context of the podcast and that we're talking about, what brains do, there you have a richer interpretation of why we're talking about the tree.
Absolutely. There's a woman, Diana Tamir, a brilliant woman at Princeton, a friend of mine who just published a paper last year about spontaneous thoughts and mind wandering and whether or not there's a mathematical kind of formula and basis to why it is the case that during the day thoughts end up the way that they do. And it's kind of like this idea of when you're at a party and there's a bunch of conversation and you leave the party, you're walking down the staircase. There's this concept, staircase wit, right? Mm-hmm. You come up with the better, wittier retort on the way out of the party, and you can't help it. And your brain just keeps like simulating, like, I should have said that, or next time I'll say that. That's simulation. That's the same thing as the Tetris bullshit. That's the brain just prototyping, instead of geometric shapes, social shapes. And like her argument, which I think is really beautiful, and I really, really hope that like the next few decades of neuroscience like find it to be true, that there's a mathematical pattern to, and you can kind of consider the layout of all of your experiences and memories as a kind of topography. Mm-hmm. And that much as rivers flow, much as you can model the statistics and dynamics of liquids or like volcanic flow or glacial melt, you can also model where spontaneous thoughts are going to go next, as if they're a river, as if they're a fluid. And like, I think it's compelling and right, because it is the case that at time point t+1, you are more likely to be closer to whatever you were thinking at time point t than a randomly selected set of, like if the brain were just random firings, like which is the reductionist response to dreams, it would just be a series of like staccato nonsense montages, right? It's not random firing. By no means is it random firing. It follows a flow. There's a character will come in and out, and maybe they're dead in your dreams, whatever, but like they're still walking across your visual field at some point, which means that at every single time point, that is a fluid thing. Like those thoughts, like you should hypothetically be able to predict where a brain will be at its next time point based on where it is. And so that's what I mean, that if we're going to apply this interpretation to dreams, we should also consider waking simulation as just as interesting. And I think there's like the dreams are kind of the like big bang of consciousness research, in the sense that people are studying them. but and they've become more mainstream, and people are starting to recognize that if we're going to understand the brain and consciousness and what it means to think, we're going to have to understand dreams, because it's
like consciousness
beautiful
itself. That you were laughed at for even uttering the word.
Yeah, you used to have to
before.
do it as an emeritus professor,
right?
you know, way
Get tenure first.
Yeah, you have to get
before
tenure
you talk
first.
about consciousness.
Well, and I think dreams are kind of like studyable in a clear way. They're kind of, it's like hard, it's a fringe, but it's done. And so that's what I mean by, in physics, it's kind of like, okay, you're studying the Big Bang. It's something that you believe that is, when you know it happened. But the waking thoughts, spontaneous thoughts during the day, I feel like that's like the dark matter. Like there's very few people that are actually studying it, and it's hard to find, it's hard to capture. You can't just like take a fishing net and like gather spontaneous thoughts. You know, it's really, really hard. But people have started to think about and model and theorize about it. And I think the interpretation of the waking dreams is the next big revolution.
Interesting.
In neuroscience and psychology. So that was my only counter argument, which is to say, if we're going to allow this interpretive layer above the reductionist kind of base, that we need to apply it agnostically across the board.
Yeah. No, that I agree with. I don't remember if I've told the story of my most memorable dream I ever had about when my grandfather died and he came back to life. Have I told this on the podcast?
You've told me. I don't remember if you've told it on the podcast. I've heard it, but
forgive me if I've already told this story.
I want to hear it again, so I imagine any listener would too.
So the most significant and memorable dream I've ever had, because it was over, 25 years ago, after my grandfather died, whom I was very close to, and he was a philosopher and an actor, and I'm kind of very, very much related to him and loved him. And he died too young in his early 60s. And he, after he died, and this is a common phenomenon, he visited me in my dream. Whether you have to, I can easily think of this as just me obviously positing this. It's not actually him visiting me, but he appeared as if he was alive in a very convincing way. And I said, "Oh my God, you've died and you've come back. What can you tell me about what it is to die?" And he said, well, I don't want to talk about it now. My time here is limited, but I wrote it all down. And so he hands me this book. And I am so excited to have the answer to everything. And then I remember so clearly, as if this had really happened. I'm in the kitchen of my house up in Coldwater Canyon in LA. And my mother says, "The toast is burning." And I suddenly at that moment realized that I was dreaming. And I said, "Mom, this is just a dream. I don't need to worry about the toast. It's not real. All I need to do is look inside this book to find the answer, like the answer to what happens after we die." And she says, "No, the toast is more important," right? And we argue. The toast pops out of the toaster, and I wake up. And I was both deeply frustrated, but also upon further analysis, and again, this is a very subjective interpretation of the dream, but I think a useful one for me, and I'm glad that I didn't just dismiss it as neurons, because it told me, according to my own interpretation, that the real life of what's happening now, that the minutia of our day-to-day existence, our quotidian concerns, are what should occupy our time right now. That we don't know the answer. We're not meant to know the answer yet, let's say. That maybe that's a pedestrian insight, but I think it was really meaningful for me at the time, and still now, to like focus on what's in front of you, and focus on the toast.
And where's the book?
And the book is just not, I don't have access to it yet. I will have access when I'm meant to have access. Maybe I'll have a dream later on in life where I'm meant to have it. But for me, remembering that dream, talking about it now, gathering insight from it, those are all worthwhile activities. And maybe they are just practicing on some level, but they are ways that I can approach my life that adds richness to it. And that's a real phenomenon. That's what I want to say.
What's your response to the counter argument, though, that like, okay, well, omens and symbols and, about going too far down the kind of
if I really believe my grandfather was, actually still alive in another domain and only could visit me in my dreams, I think that would just be like giving too much credence to that. It's insufficient evidence. And there's always, if there's a simpler explanation, you should go for the simpler explanation, right? So the rationalist in me says you can have the rich interpretation without having to I'm sure there's a technical word for doing this, right? But getting too much positing too much credence on the evidence, let's say, or giving too much weight. What is the word for getting too much? Like conspiracy theorists do this all the time. They take minimal information and deduce too much from it. Right?
I would call it overfitting.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the right word though.
It must be a both or a scientific and philosophical error that people make. Right? They take too few. Too little information and deduce too much from it.
I went about 4 years, maybe 6, where I didn't have a single dream that I remembered.
And what do you think was happening there?
Really, really poor sleep.
Right.
I had disrupted poor sleep.
Did you get worse at social interactions?
I got worse at everything.
Yeah.
But what I found so interesting was like.
But since you dream specifically about social interactions, I was wondering if that's what suffered the most.
Interesting. No, I think I personally, I don't know. I don't even know what this is based on, but I think most of the simulation is not happening during REM dreams. Like the dreams that you remember are actually, they kind of happen in real time.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of happen approximately, a minute passes and it takes a minute.
Mm-hmm.
The way to get better at stuff is when your brain is in it's dark matter, it's unconscious, when it's processing things at 10,000x speed and iterating and prototyping and breaking down every possibility. The Tetris shapes times 1,000. So I think that's where most memory or most learning is happening.
So that's regardless of whether we remember or have even the dreams.
Well, and so exactly. Regardless of if we remember them. But what I found so interesting about that period of my life, if I look back on it, is it felt like I was consistently me. Like I just always woke up without interruption, without conscious interruption. For years, it was just me looking out upon this world. I never had a counterfactual. I never had another version. I never had a little inner palace to go to or a place to escape to. It was just me and this world, brutally leashed together with no escape for 6 years straight. And then when I kind of fixed my sleeping, they came back, and I love them. They're so great. I didn't realize I needed these mid-afternoon naps for consciousness and subjectivity.
One of my favorite books I've ever read, and I haven't thought about this in decades, but when I used to smoke not a lot of cigarettes, but I smoked every day 5 or 10 cigarettes, and there was a kind of critical theory professor at University of Chicago, I think, who wanted to give up smoking and was not able to give it up with what he thought of as a shallow interpretation of why we smoke. So the party line is, we know cigarettes are bad for us, and yet the tobacco companies put things in it that make them really addictive, and therefore we smoke even though we don't want to, right? And we have a physical addiction to it, and it's totally irrational. And he said that doesn't go deep enough in explaining why I smoke, and I won't be able to quit smoking until I truly understand it. And so he wrote a book called Cigarettes Are Sublime, and tracing the iconography of the cigarette and all the meaningful ways it did exactly what you're talking about, which is what made me think about it, gave life these little parentheses and these little pauses of a stoic semi-removal from involvement. So he analyzed a whole chapter about how so often people's dying wish before they're about to be executed on the firing line is a cigarette, right? Because there you are saying fuck you to the whatever's happening. I'm taking this moment that's separate, that's not yours, it's my moment with my cigarette, right? And there was this and there's and then he looked at the cigarette in movies and Humphrey Bogart and his cigarette and all of the things that made the cigarette such a unique 20th century phenomenon too, and how it was different from all the other ages. And he imagined somebody coming from another era and not understanding what if any way the world had progressed, life had progressed, and then they see this they really understand the cigarette and they're like, aha, I get it now.
Yeah.
And so it was this like love letter to the cigarette, love book to the cigarette.
Yeah.
And only after like going that deep and then understanding it was he able to smoke his last one and say goodbye, you know, in a way that was like, again, we could go back to this word meaningful, and meaningfulness being a real phenomenon that if you ignore it, you're missing out. You're missing out on a deeper truth about what it is to be human.
Yeah. Yeah. I really I remember someone telling me that if you're at a party and you're sitting alone by the window and you're staring out the open window, not talking to anyone, you're just kind of a loner.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have a cigarette and you're doing that same thing, you're suddenly a philosopher. And it's this thing where like there is this interpretive frame that, I mean, I think one thing, and back to Heidegger a bit, like the being whose being is at issue for itself. I think one thing we are so exquisitely good at is the kind of shoulder version of the meta thought, which is to say the frame which can kind of orient all smaller actions. And so, for example, like you can't tell a dog it's adopted and have its whole life collapse and change every previous memory.
Yeah, exactly.
But you can tell a human they're adopted, and suddenly everything they thought they knew, one single sentence said by the right person, can completely change, physically change a lifetime of memories. And that's something the human brain can do that I don't think anything else can do.
Even we talked yesterday about like the way the way we interpret like these minute temporal differences of how long it takes someone to answer a text message.
Fucking, I need some, My phone's off only because I want to aggregate the text messages that I'm desperately waiting to receive, so that when I look at them at 2 hours, they hopefully just come like flooding and rushing to me. But of course I won't get one.
Oh God, it's so incredible the way our mind will just. And again, are we just driving ourselves crazy? I mean, obviously, we're talking about girls.
Melody sent me a fucking text message.
So you text, and then how long it takes for the answer to come is a domain rich with meaning.
Yeah.
And the way we play those games is just amazing. That should be the topic for another day, because now we're 51 minutes in, and I think it's time to say goodbye for the day.
See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.